trade commissioner service for 7 years, but I do remember it very fondly, and I probably know some of the people in your group, but maybe not most of
them. Right. Yeah, well, some of the old stalwarts are still there. Jim Elliott, you know.
Right.
You might know some of them.
All right.
I wonder if you get a list of who is attending this session. I guess
we are, sorry to interrupt, but we're live on YouTube.
Okay, let me just formally sort of begin this. So here I am. Those of you who follow me on my YouTube channel, you know me. I'm Steve, the keen language learner. And an early part of my career, I was in the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, which is part of the diplomatic service. That part of the diplomatic service that deals with trade and helping Canadians sell their products overseas, negotiating, access for Canadian products and all this kind of thing. And so because of that, I regularly get copied on an email sent out by John Lang for those former members of the diplomatic service who live around Ottawa, and they gather together in a pub and drink beer there. And so because of COVID, John suggested that since they can't get together, that it would be a good idea to have different former trade commissioners or foreign service officers talk about some things that might be of interest to other members of the group. So I volunteered that I would talk about my experience with learning languages after the age of 60. So that's what's behind this. And we'll have a group of, 20 or so people, and I look forward to talking to them. And John Lang is the organizer. Hi, John.
Hi. Welcome, Steve.
Okay. So, when I would say that my initial exposure to language learning was when I was a trade commissioner, because although I had spent 3 years as a student in France, and therefore, got my French up to pretty good level because I had to do all my classes in French. I went to Sciences Po in Paris, not long after Pierre Trudeau. But, I don't want to accept any, blame for that. But I was sent to Hong Kong as a Chinese language, student, because Canada was getting ready to recognize the People's Republic of China. And they needed people who could speak Chinese. And so I was sent there. So I learned Chinese and went in and out of China. I was at the Canton Trade Fair quite a few times, went up to Beijing with our first Canadian mission there to find a site for our embassy, as we in fact did recognize China. And I was with a small group of people, and that was my first chance in Beijing. It was amazing to see Beijing in 1970. Beijing in 1970 is not at all like the Beijing of today. Beijing in 1970 was much, much closer to Beijing in 1870 than Beijing of today is to Beijing of 1970. Not much had changed. Then I was in Japan for 9 years. And, I was in the sort of international trade in wood products. And obviously my Japanese language that I picked up while living in Japan was very beneficial, because I was offered a position with first one, then another major BC lumber exporting company, based on the fact that I could speak Japanese and had very good contacts in the downstream sort of wood distribution and home builders sector in Japan. And then I set up my own company, and we did a lot of business in Europe. And so German and Swedish, even to some extent Spanish. And so along the way, I developed, I would say, starting with my Chinese experience, a certain sort of approach to learning languages. An approach that basically, what I sort of discovered was mostly you just have to get the language in you. If you try to approach the language via theory, via grammatical explanation, via declension tables, you will be defeated, because it's impossible to remember those things if your brain has not been exposed to enough of the language. Once you have a sense of the language through massive exposure, listening and reading, then some of these explanations start to make sense because they refer to something that you already know. But if you try to explain the language before you've had this exposure, you don't understand the explanation. You certainly won't remember it. You won't be able to apply it when you speak, because you need to develop certain habits. Now, in your exposure to the language, you may not notice certain things. So it is possible that a grammar explanation might point out some small details that you missed. But overwhelmingly, for the bulk of the language that you have to get into you as a habit, as a new language habit, that comes from massive listening and reading. And so, I mean, probably, I don't know if you can see it, but in behind me is a massive amount of CDs in every possible language, from Russian to German to Japanese to Spanish to Czech to Swedish. And so for a long time, I used to listen to these CDs and read the corresponding book or eventually ebook. Prior to that, when I was learning Chinese, of course, we had these open reel tape recorders. So I had to sit in my room and listen to the tape recorder, but I listened a lot. And in Hong Kong, I would go to bookstores, scouring the bookstores for readers in Chinese, where there were, you know, sort of word lists beside each lesson, because to look something up in a dictionary, particularly in Chinese, where it's so time consuming to look something up in a dictionary, and then when we close the dictionary, we have already forgotten whatever the meaning was that was there. I mean, that's just how it is. Language learning is about forgetting. So you have to have some means of having the meaning of these words that you didn't know, you look them up, you kind of start to know, you still don't know it. It has to be handy for you. And what has happened to language learning, I would say in the last 10, 15 years, is that we no longer have open reel tape recorders. We don't even really need CDs anymore, because we can download everything we need from the internet, because we can listen to it on our iPhone, we can listen to it on our computer if we want, we can listen to it on our iPod Nano when we go jogging. In other words, the audio has become so tremendously, you know, portable. The other thing that has happened is that if we read in an electronic format, we can click on words and immediately see the meaning. We can forget them again, but at least it's easy to see quickly, you know, what the meaning was. And then you continue reading in the text. So you stay in the text. You don't get sidetracked by spending 30 seconds to look something up in the dictionary. So what has happened? So with these things happening, at the age of 60, I decided to learn Russian. Oh, by the way, around that time, so I decided to learn Russian, and we decided, my son and I decided to create a website for language learning. The background of that is that I had a company in wood products, and we were buying wood from Europe, from North America. We were shipping to Japan, we were shipping to Europe. We were dealing with currencies, nominal, net, metric, board feet, and of course, shipping schedules, and customers wanted to know when the wood was coming, and we wanted to make sure that the mills were producing on time. So we had a department that created this software that enabled us to manage all of this information, you know, pull up schedules, produce shipping documents, and so forth. So we had this software capability. I was learning Cantonese. I found out about a Chinese immigrant to Canada who had all his savings stolen at Vancouver Airport. And I was listening to Cantonese radio, local radio here, and heard about him. And I said, well, we'll hire this guy because he was in IT. And if he's good, then that's good for us. And if he's no good, then at least we helped him out. He stayed 6 months, then went back to China. But he had a high score in TOEFL, test of English as a foreign language. But he couldn't communicate really in English. He didn't really understand what we were saying. We had a lot of trouble understanding what he was saying. So we developed a system. We developed a system whereby people who are already at a sort of low intermediate level, by listening to content that's relevant to them and having the ability to look up words and save words to a database and review these words, and we developed a bunch of functionality that would help these people, like this immigrant specifically, initially, improve his English. Well, he eventually went back to China. We then had this system. We went to the government to say, look, you have a lot of skilled immigrants coming to Canada. And I knew from my own experience that a lot of these so-called skilled immigrants, particularly from China, where the language skills are not great, they ended up working in a warehouse somewhere for $5 an hour for another Chinese, boss. And I felt if those people could improve their language skills, in fact, I knew that the biggest obstacle those people faced was their language. It wasn't at a level where they could operate in an office environment. Unfortunately, the immigration department is more interested in sort of supporting what they consider to be the stakeholders, and that is the immigration service organizations. They in turn are only interested in getting bodies into their classrooms so they can get more funding from the government. We never got anywhere with that. And then we decided, well, we'll make it a multi-language platform where people around the world teach each other their languages. And so now we have 37 languages. A good portion of the language content that we have for each language is provided by our members. And each lesson in any language consists of audio with text. So with the audio, you can download, if it's a course of 10 lessons, you can download them to your iPhone and listen to it whenever you want as a playlist. You can add individual lessons to a playlist. So you can listen to it whenever, wherever you want, which is what I do. I listen when I'm making breakfast, because I'm the one who gets up and makes breakfast. I listen when I'm cleaning up after having a wonderful gourmet meal prepared by my wife. It's only fair that I clean up, but I listen. So, and if I'm in the car, I listen. If I'm exercising, I listen. So there's lots of opportunity to listen. So when you listen, then you don't understand. You may understand 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%. So then I'm curious now. I want to know what that was. So then I go to our lesson page in our system, Link, and then I can look up words. Every time, if I see a word that the system tells me if it's a word I haven't seen before, I then look it up. It then changes color. As I get to know the word better, it changes color again. It creates flashcards. It creates statistics. I have a sense of how many words I've read, how many words I know, and on and on. I mean, there's a lot of functionality there. Oh, I was going to say, by the way, that when I started on this, I wrote a book about language learning, which was also translated into Chinese. I even went to China and gave talks about it. And the book was written in 2003 maybe. And basically nothing that I wrote there about how languages are learned has changed. I remain convinced that contrary to the way languages are taught, where there's a lot of emphasis on getting people to say things and getting people to say things correctly, and which of course is impossible, which only leads to frustration. The emphasis should be entirely on comprehension, a much more sort of passive approach, building up our vocabulary, building up our sense of the language, building up sort of a comfort zone so that when we start to speak, we have a greater chance of achieving success. And at that point, when we review issues of grammar, we have a better chance of understanding those issues of grammar and applying them. So that will be my introductory diatribe, and I look forward to questions.
Steve, I think you're absolutely right. I can remember the few times that I studied languages prior to going on a posting, being frustrated at being introduced to the future pluperfect conjunctive before I actually knew how to ask where is the train station.
Right.
They were following a curriculum which bore absolutely no resemblance to my requirements.
Yeah, this is true, and they continue to do it. They continue to do it. Okay, let me see if I see how you have a question. John Trelevin, I'm in violent agreement with Steve. All right. Oh, John Trelevin wants to speak. So, Eric, can you enable John Trelevin? You see that? Are you still with us, Eric?
Yes,
Okay.
I will give John access in a
Okay,
sec.
sure. All right. I like the violent agreement. That's much better than violent disagreement. All right. Oh, here we are. But you're muted, John.
Okay, I'm in complete agreement. First posting Sao Paulo, having done French in Canada and all that stuff. And Beverly and I went to a language school outside of Rio, 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, entirely in Portuguese with a teacher who spoke no English or French. And what we did each night for about another 5 hours was memorize dialogue. And I later learned that this was actually the Berlitz approach.
Right.
Why it never was the Canadian government's French language school approach, or indeed the Ontario Secondary School French teachers approach, I have never understood. Because the secret is, just as you say, this is of course before electronic means, the secret was to get you talking the way a child learns a language. Don't worry about mistakes. And the truth is that in 4 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, I could speak Portuguese well enough that I usually didn't need a translator, except the time I agreed to a tailor in Sao Paulo and putting buttons on my side pockets on my suit. But absolutely right. And I just think somehow the language establishment in Ottawa, they're not in the, well, this is ancient times now. They really weren't in the communications business.
Right.
They were in the perfection business, but your approach is entirely correct. Thanks, Steve.
Thank
Congratulations.
you. I saw in the Q&A, Eric, that Bob Fairweather would like to speak, but it's disappeared now. And oh, answered? Oh, sure, one moment speak. Okay. All right, so I'm assuming then that Eric is on top of all the questions and comments and he can enable people to speak. John, I would say that obviously if you have the luxury of having a teacher 5 hours a day, then that is ideal. But for many people learning languages, that's just not possible. So I have found, and I have to admit that when I was learning Mandarin Chinese, I had 3 hours a day with a teacher. But now I don't have that option. And I don't really want to be 3 hours a day on Skype with tutors. So I have found that the portability of just listening and reading, eventually I start to speak. And in my most recent languages, Farsi, Arabic, and Turkish, I went at it for 3 months with lots of listening and started doing, once or twice a week with a tutor. And at the end of that, I was speaking. But the bulk of the time that I spent was the time that's so easy to organize, and that's just plain listening and reading. Again, if you live in Brazil, when I lived in Japan, it was easier to get out and just use what you had. Not so easy, say, here in Vancouver. I occasionally sneak up on a local Iranian and hit them with my Persian, with great delight on their part. Anyway, I see Bob Fairweather is ready to go here.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Oh, good. First of all, I'd like to say hello to everyone who's on the web cam system. This Zoom is great, and it's nice to see some old faces. A couple of things. Would you stop referring to your son Mark as Eric?
That's not Mark. Sorry, Bob. Modern technology, because of our account with Zoom, but it's actually Eric Robertson, who works for LingQ, who is managing the controls. Okay. My son Eric is in London, in isolation or whatever they're doing over there, and Mark is busy working. So in fact, it is Eric, but not my son Eric, but Eric Robertson.
Oh, okay.
I appreciate the concern that Steve's gone senile. I appreciate it.
Well, I kept looking at Mark's names on the board, and you're referring to Eric, whom I know is your oldest son. So, but I just want to make a comment about Steve's language ability. I've been with him on a number of occasions when we run into people at a sushi restaurant and speaking Japanese, or at a sushi restaurant speaking Chinese, and with great facility he moves between Cantonese and Mandarin and amazes the people. So his approach to language learning has a lot of credibility as far as I'm concerned, because I know that within a short period of time, with his dedication to learning any specific language, he comes out speaking it very well. And so good on you, Steve. And I don't know, I think you're up to what, 20 languages now or something?
I'm working on 19 and 20, although I was listening to Turkish this morning, which would be 21. But I can't say that I speak them well, but I do enjoy them. I listen to podcasts from Al Jazeera. Yeah. I was listening to a podcast on Al Jazeera, and it's very topical. They're talking about John Bolton's book and Trump and the Qatar, blockading, being blockaded by. It's interesting. So you learn the language, and through the language, you learn a bunch of stuff.
Well, it's nice to know that someone of our age can still learn a language. So
You, Bob, don't talk down at your cohorts here. All right. But one thing that I find very frustrating with Bob is that, and like I find that the more time I put into learning languages, the better I get. That's not true with golf. And it pisses me off when I go out and play golf with Bob because he's just so much better than I am.
I see. And I too, John, wish that I were closer to Ottawa to attend some of the pub meetings, but I'm glad that I'm on your circulation list, so at least I know when they are, and if ever I'm in Ottawa, that they could find a time to.
Yeah, you can have a vicarious
one.
beer with us from
Yeah.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
I see a question here from Alf Davis. What do you think of the Babel approach? You know what? I'm not sure that I know what the Babel approach is. I am familiar with Rosetta Stone, Duolingo. I don't know. Obviously, if you ask me what I think of any other approach, I'm going to say it's no good. I am prejudiced, all right? But I do happen to believe that any approach that uses pictures or multiple choice or things of that nature, that is not at least how I like to learn languages. I think you want to start with some kind of context. So in my own case, when I start a language at LingQ, we have these 60 mini stories. Each of the mini stories has a lot of repetition. They're focused on the high frequency verbs, need, want, give, take, go, come, all this kind of stuff. And they exist in I don't know, over 30 languages. And there's so much repetition in each story. And I listen to these over and over and over again. And that's how I get launched into a language. No pictures. Because, how are you going to represent need or want or give or take? It's just difficult. You can't use pictures for everything. Duolingo has a lot of disjointed sentences and phrases that they sort of give you. Whereas the stories, they're not necessarily tremendously interesting because they've been written using these high frequency verbs and high frequency, call them conjunctions. But as you listen to it, and listening is such an easy thing to do. I don't have to sit in front of the screen and look at pictures. I can be in my car, I can be working out. So, that's what I tend to do. And our functionality at LingQ is built around that concept. But of course, there are other systems, Rosetta Stone, Babel, whatever. And I think I would be jaundiced against them if I were to comment on them, Pimsleur or whatever. So short of knowing more about Babel, there's not much I can say to Alf Davis.
Mhm.
All right. Any other questions? Q&A. What do we got here in Q&A? Okay. How does one begin when the language is ideographic or Cyrillic? Okay, well, Cyrillic is a lot easier than ideographic, okay? Cyrillic, in my own case, I read some languages that have alphabets, and Cyrillic obviously is an alphabet. So for Russian, for Ukrainian, then Greek I can read, and Hangul, which is the Korean. And all of those, you have a finite, and even Arabic, which is Arabic Persian, which is kind of more difficult because it's not always obvious how things are pronounced. But at least there's a finite number of symbols. Whereas once you get into Chinese and Japanese, there's just a lot of work in learning those characters. So in the case of Chinese characters, I had a system back 50 years ago. I had 1,000 flashcards, actual real flashcards, not the computer variety. And I would take 10 of them every day, and I would write the first one out 10 times. And I had this sort of squared paper. So I'd write the first ideogram or character out 10 times down one column. Then I would put the meaning 3 columns over. pick another one, write it down. And by the third character, I've run into the first one again because I put it over 3 columns to the right. And then I write it again 10 times. So I would do this for 10 characters. I eventually got it up to 30 characters. Basic assumption is that half of what you learn, you're going to forget. So you have to shuffle the cards back into the pile and learn them again and again and again. But like so much in language learning, if you stay with it, you will gradually get better. The brain learns. The brain learns slowly, but the brain learns. So I think this is an important point. And with regard to Cyrillic, I mean, you just have to stay with it. Or Arabic. At first, it's very difficult. It's never quite as comfortable as reading in the Latin alphabet, but slowly you get better. Like in everything to do with language, we slowly get better if we keep doing it. And I think sometimes the people who are not so successful in language learning, they become impatient. They feel they should be able to speak correctly now. They should be able to understand everything now. And of course, it doesn't work that way. And even some of the most basic things, like the word for, I don't know, shoe or something, when we need it, we can't find it, even though we in fact know that word. So, I mean, there's so many things, opportunities for people to get frustrated in language learning. But if you accept the fact that the brain is there to create like patterns, that's what the brain does. That's how we get through life, because the brain half the time anticipates what's going to happen because it's happened before. And so the brain, that's what the brain does. And we have to trust the brain that it will gradually create patterns around this new language. And so whether it is a matter of grammatical structures or writing systems, you just have to keep going. And I think a lot of people don't have the patience, you know, or they want to, like Bob, they want to go out and play golf or something. So.
Right.
Okay. Do you have a website to contact you? Martha Davis. So yeah, so you can contact me. First of all, email. First of all, the name of the website that I use, which is where I've learned since the age of 60. I've learned more or less 11 languages. The site is called LingQ, LingQ.com. And if you want to send me an email, I'm steve@lingq.com. So, and if you want to watch my videos in different languages, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is called Lingo Steve, I see that Eric is writing that out. So that Lingo Steve is a YouTube channel where I have, in fact, 250,000 subscribers. I don't think they'll show up every time, but and I talk, and my message is to encourage people. Regardless of your age, regardless of any other consideration, if you want to learn the language and you're willing to put in the time, if you have the right attitude, you're going to learn. And yeah, so you can have a look there too. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, I question in the Q&A here. Oh, Bob Feather? No. Open. Oh, Peter Drabble. Don't you mix languages when you speak so many? Yes, absolutely. And obviously, you know, you have to make a choice. Like I could try to focus on one language and become as good at that language as it's possible to be. Or I can continue exploring new languages. Once you start exploring new languages, obviously you're not going to be as good in the earlier languages as you would like to be. And you're also going to start confusing them. And, but to me, my main objective in learning a language is comprehension and exploring that language. Like right now, by being able to understand some Arabic, some Persian, some Turkish, I have a totally different perspective on the Middle East. It drives me to read books. I'm reading a book right now about the Persian influence in India, for example. I have a better understanding of how those cultures have interacted with each other. And the other thing I like to do is I like to be able to communicate. So I can communicate with mistakes. I can speak Portuguese, and of course my Portuguese is not as good as my Spanish, and so it's sometimes called portuñol. because I throw Spanish into my Portuguese, but everyone understands me and I understand them. So, and of course, if I go, let's say I was in Brazil a year or so ago, and I'm very much, as I moved from Argentina into Brazil, it was heavier to Portuñol, and by the third day, it was closer to Portuguese. So I think one of the conditions of being a successful language learner is that you have to accept imperfection, uncertainty, not understanding, not remembering, getting things wrong. I mean, that just goes with the territory. If you don't like those things, then you stay in your own language. The other thing I do, if I know, like tomorrow morning, I have a live stream in Russian. So I haven't been doing any Russian. And Russian is one of those languages that has a lot of grammatical issues, verbs of motion, declension, whatnot. So I will spend a few hours listening to stuff on our website, particularly our mini stories, to try to at least refresh some of those habits. So you can, just simply by listening and reading, you can refresh some habits, bring back some vocabulary. So then when you start speaking, you might make fewer mistakes, but you'll still make mistakes. And personally, it doesn't bother me. As long as I can understand what they're saying and I can get my meaning across with the odd, mistake, that's fine with me. Are there any languages that do not have a rhythm and are therefore harder to learn? Okay. I mean, obviously every language has its rhythm. French is more monotonous than English. Chinese, like Mandarin, there the intonation actually affects the meaning of the individual words. In English, we have similar, high rising, high falling, similar tones to Chinese, but we use them for emphasis. French is more monotonous, but still there is that rhythm in French. And I think it's very important to try to capture that rhythm when we're imitating the language. And for example, when I learn a language, at LingQ, we have a thing called sentence mode, where I can go into and go through a lesson sentence by sentence. And many of our lessons are time-stamped so that I can have not text to speech, but actually the original voice saying that sentence. And then I'll try and repeat, the sentence the way the native speaker said it to try to get that natural intonation. Because I think a big part of pronunciation is actually getting the rhythm, the intonation of the language. And very often English speakers, when they speak French, for example, and they throw English intonation in there, we get the standard English version of French. And the goal, I think, is to, if we're speaking French, to try to be a little more, to capture the intonation of French a little more. But I'm not aware of any language that has no intonation. I think their intonation for each language is different. Swedish is very up and down. Spanish, especially in Spain, is much more machine gun. And those are just things that we try to imitate. Okay. Genetic component. All right. So, yes, my parents, I'm not sure it's genetic. Genetic component is to suggest that, for example, in Sweden, a lot of people speak English very well, or in Holland, or in Singapore, and therefore those people have some language gene. I don't believe it's genetic. I believe that as a child, I was exposed to a number of languages because I was born in Sweden, moved to Canada when I was 5. My parents were originally from Czechoslovakia. They spoke German and Czech at home. So I heard these languages, even though I couldn't speak them. However, there are polyglot gatherings around the world, polyglot conferences. And I sometimes attend these and I give talks there. And I was in a room of 600 people in Montreal at what is known as the Langue Fest, the Festival des Langues, polyglot conference, 600 people. I said, in my own case, I had this language exposure as a child, although I promptly forgot Swedish. So essentially, by the age of 16, I was unilingual English because I was a victim of the French language instruction in English language schools in Canada. But I said, in this room, how many of you grew up in a family that was multilingual? And these are all polyglots. And if you ever go to one of these polyglot gatherings, people have, you know, tags on where they have a flag of every language they speak, and they'll have 10 flags. And so if you see a flag of a language that you speak, you can then start talking to them in that language. So it's quite an exciting sort of gathering. Of 600 people, I don't think there were 5 hands that went up. So that the vast majority, like the overwhelming majority of those polyglots, in fact, grew up in a monolingual family. And so it's possible that genetics influences it's possible that being exposed to languages influences you at an early age. It's possible that age influences you. It's possible that I'm not as good a language learner now as I was 50 years ago. I think those things are minor. I think the biggest thing is your attitude. In other words, am I interested? Am I interested in learning the language? Am I interested in the language? Do I like the language? Am I motivated? Do I believe I can do it? Do I believe learning the language is worthwhile because it takes time? So while I'm doing it, am I happy that I'm doing it? Or do I wish I were out playing golf like Bob? You know, sort of being in the moment. That attitude thing is important, and the amount of time you spend. So people say, oh, Steve, you're just good at languages. Yeah, but nobody, I am a total outlier in terms of the amount of time that I'm willing to spend on languages. You know, who else gets up in the morning, every morning, and starts listening to Arabic while making breakfast? All right, that puts me in a special category. I don't know what category that is. So the answer to your question is, I don't think the genetic consideration or even being exposed to languages at an early age is as important as a person's motivation and the amount of time they put in. And even if there are differences, that doesn't mean the person who is, you know, less favored by genetics or family environment can't learn. It may be that person A learns faster than person B, but person B will also learn. I find the internet great to maintain my German and hear news from another perspective. I use an internet. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a golden age of language learning. There are so many resources available, podcasts, radio stations, Netflix, YouTube. YouTube has subtitles. We have a browser extension on our website where we can bring in any video from YouTube in Russian and Turkish and Spanish, Chinese, and it becomes a lesson so that I can then read the dialogue and learn those words and phrases. We can do the same with Netflix, but unfortunately Netflix blocks us from bringing in the video and the audio, but at least I can get the dialogue and work on the words and phrases. So, I mean, if I compare the environment today with the internet and MP3 players, etc., with when I lived in Hong Kong learning Chinese, I wasn't about to pick up my open reel tape recorder and carry it, you know, a ghetto blaster, carry it around Hong Kong. Probably wouldn't have lasted very long. Anyway. Okay, any other questions? All right. Oh, Bob.
I have a golf date, so I have to sign off now. Most interesting.
Okay,
Most
see you, Bob. Thanks for showing up. We'll
That's
have
been
to have
very
a
interesting.
golf
Thank you.
sometime so you can humiliate me again.
Yeah, that was great, Steve. I'm wandering around when I go on my health walks, listening to the radio station I began listening to in 1969 in Sao Paulo.
Which is?
Jovem Pan. That's how I keep up my Portuguese.
Okay. Because I got some podcasts from Globo.
Oh.
And they're very good.
Well, I keep listening to the coronavirus crisis unfurl itself in Brazil because they have this national talk show.
Right.
And yeah, when Bolsonaro fired his health minister, it was a thing. But anyway, it's just fun to be able to. And by the way, just so we're clear, 50 years ago, one of the main sponsors on Jovem Pan was a company called Pilomax that promised to grow hair.
Oh, yeah.
They're still a major sponsor. Clearly, I did not buy enough.
Ah. You didn't do it right.
Steve, that was a great discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much for everyone coming out. And yeah, good luck.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's wonderful to see you occupied and
Yes.
enjoying something you're very good at. So you're an inspiration.
Omerito gozaimasu.
Ah. どういたしまして.
Join again.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy yourselves.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.